Hi, I'm Bill Bradley. Join me for a recent excerpt of American Voices. Who do you appreciate right now? Is it hard to think of someone right away? Well, now imagine challenging yourself with that question every day for a year. Life coach Tracey Gates decided to have a year of appreciation. Every day, she would write a handwritten letter to a different person to show appreciation for 365 days straight. And she couldn't tuck the letter away in her drawer. No, the letter had to be sent. She wrote a book about the experience. It's called The Power of a Few Kind Words, Create a More Meaningful Life, One Letter at a Time. Tracey Gates is here with me now to tell us all about this gratitude adventure. Tracey, welcome to American Voices.
Oh, Senator, thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege and a treat.
So the title of the book is A Few Kind Words, is something that has special meaning for you. Can you tell us about your father, these words, and what he taught you?
The book really is it's a legacy of love to my father. When I was growing up, if anybody in our family asked my father what he wanted for Christmas or his birthday, he said the same thing every time. And that was, all I want is a few kind words. And we hated that because it was just, how do you wrap that up? We'd be like, Dad, really, I love you, but here's a tie. And we never really, we never took the time, I think collectively as a family, to understand that words of appreciation were his language of love. And then sadly and suddenly, when I was 24 and engaged for just 4 weeks, I got a phone call from my mother. And all she said was, when I picked up the phone, was, honey, daddy died. And it was absolutely shattering to me. He had had a heart attack on the tennis court, and he would never get to walk me down the aisle, and I would never get to give him a few kind words. And I never really took to heart what a few kind words meant to him until I became a life and wellness coach, 30 years later in my 50s. And then I just started to write letters of appreciation. And when I went on this crazy journey, I called it A Few Kind Words, really as a legacy of love to my dad.
Well, that's a beautiful sentiment. I'm sure that he might be hearing you,
I certainly think he is.
So how did you first get the idea to write a letter of appreciation every day for a year?
I went through a period of time that was a difficult time in my life. I was having some work stress, and then I was caring for our beautiful, wonderful mother who was, in her 90s, and she was declining. And I suddenly developed an autoimmune disease. And I really believe that that was all stress induced. And I started to have this sort of thought of, well, if stress and worry is causing my body to break down and to have physical pain attached to it, what would happen if I actually challenged myself to do the reverse and to introduce kindness into my day, put it on my to-do list every day for a year?
Mm-hmm.
And I did just that. And it was amazing. My pain was reduced, but more importantly,
Is that
it brought a
right?
level. Absolutely. There is such a physical release of endorphins, of those feel-good chemicals, when you slow down and you fill your mind with positivity. It was such an incredible experiment, really, because I felt my stress reduce. I felt so much more calm and mindful. And then I had this physical release of pain. And I'm not saying that cured the autoimmune disease without going to a doctor, but I felt like it was absolutely a very important piece to my healing.
So you mean simply by surrounding yourself with joy and gratitude that it contributed to you being better?
Absolutely. And I feel like it's something that every single one of us who walk on this earth has the power to make ourselves feel better emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, when we do this, what I call an intentional kindness practice. And when we fill our mind with positive things as opposed to judgmental things, negative things, we become more open to just appreciating what is beautiful in this world. And it doesn't leave as much room anymore for all of the negativity that is bombarding us every single day in the news.
What was the time between when you had this realization that you were going to try to do this and see if it produced any physical results, and the time when you actually started?
It was just a matter of weeks, actually.
Mm-hmm.
My husband and I were flying from Princeton, New Jersey, where I know you spent some time. That's where
Mm-hmm.
we live, to Portland, Oregon, to meet our brand new grandson. And I was on the plane and I just had this sort of aha moment. I kind of put my head back on the seat and I was actually sort of, speaking to myself. I was speaking to my dad and I was telling him about this new great grandchild of his. And I just suddenly was filled with this idea of, I'm going to write a letter a day for a year. And I knew in that moment, my first letter would be to our new grandson, and my last letter would be to my dad, who had passed away 33 years earlier,
And you began the next day?
probably 2 weeks later.
You had to get all the pencils sharpened.
I did. I had to visit with our grandson out in Oregon and then come home and sort of regroup. And then I just started.
Could you give us an example? I mean, what would you say in a letter to somebody?
I have three, I call it the three super S's of sort of how I teach people how to write these letters. And that's to keep it simple, keep it sincere, and most importantly, to keep it specific. Because it's why you appreciate them that makes them read that letter more than once, potentially get tears, share that letter, and most importantly, save that letter. It's pretty hard to throw away nice sentiments about you.
Were you ever at a loss for what to write or who to write to next?
I was never at a loss for what to write, but there certainly were times where I had to kind of go on a reconnaissance mission and think about who I was going to write now. And that actually, it may sound funny, but it was part of the joy of this journey, because I first started out writing, I kind of made a list, probably had maybe 100 people on it of the people, the most, your most intimate family and friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, people I volunteer with. I sort of came up with those obvious people I went to high school with in college. But the rest of the people, it was sort of, who did I happen upon in my day?
Hmm.
Or what jogged my memory about, who popped into my mind randomly. And I tell you, some of the most fun people to write to were the people I didn't know well, but I had a positive experience with.
And I understand you never used the words thank you in your letters. Why was that?
Because I think there's something very different between a thank you letter and an appreciation letter. And I am a big proponent of thank you letters. So for sure, keep sending them. Tell people thank you for things that they do and offer to you. But an appreciation letter to me is more of a feeling of gratitude as opposed to an expression of gratitude. And I think that thank you can be overused sometimes. And also, I think we hide behind it. We just sort of think that thank you is a blanket statement. But people don't often receive a letter that says, I really appreciate you, and here's why. And when you don't have the word thank you, it makes you just get a little more thoughtful, I think, in how you write the letter.
I think that's a really interesting observation, the difference between appreciation and thank you. I think that's something to think about.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about some of the letters that you did write and how they were received?
Sure. First of all, I will say that the most important thing in writing these letters to me is that you write never having any expectation to hear back from the recipient. These letters are to be written because they make you, the writer, feel good about who you are. That fills you with positivity. So I would keep note cards in my purse, in my car, at home, wherever I was, never knowing where I was going to find my recipient. And so my recipient this one day was very unexpected. I was called for jury duty. And when I got to the courthouse, I was standing on a long line of probably 150 people. And you have to check in with one of two women sitting behind a desk. And when it was my turn, I showed my barcode. She scanned me in. And then she did something that I didn't expect. She took the time to look up, make eye contact with me, and then say my name. She said, "Good morning, Tracey. We're so glad you're here. Please take a seat wherever you want in the room. And when everyone is checked in, we'll tell you how the day is going to unfold." And in that kind of a situation, I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
expecting eye contact and my name.
Hmm.
So I sat in the front of the room And I watched these two women check everybody in, and every single person they addressed by name. And it
Hmm.
just really resonated with me that was a lovely touch, an unexpected touch. So when everybody was settled, one of the women stood up and she proceeded to talk to us about what the day was going to look like. She started out by saying how much she appreciated our time and really acknowledged that giving 1 day, 2 days, 3 days for jury duty can be a real disruption in people's lives. And then she also sprinkled a lot of humor throughout it. And one of the things she said was when we get dismissed from our jury, we have to come back into this room and be scanned out. Otherwise, we'll be arrested. And she just she made the experience much more welcoming and comfortable for everybody. So when she finished and we were just sitting there waiting to be called, I was having all these nice thoughts about her. So I thought, well, she's going to get my letter for the day. And I took out my note card and I just I wrote her a note. Then I got called for my jury. And when she wasn't looking, I left it on her desk. And I had asked the other woman what her name was, and it was Miss Davis. So I had addressed it to Miss Davis, left it on her desk. The next day, I got dismissed from my jury. They came back into the room. The same two women are sitting there with another 150 people the next day. And I checked out, and it wasn't with Miss Davis because she was busy with someone else. And the woman who scanned me in said, "Wait a minute." She then tapped Miss Davis on the shoulder, who looked at me, and she said, "You come here." And she kind of, with her finger said, "Come on over here." And she walked around to the front of the desk. And then she did something that just I'll remember for the rest of my life. She gave me probably a 30-second pre-COVID hug. And she said, "No one has ever done that for me before. You made not only my day, but my week, my month, my year." And she said, "I've been doing this job for 28 years.
Hmm.
And I went home that night. I read the letter to my family, and I am now keeping note cards in my purse, and I'm going to pay this forward."
Oh, what a beautiful story.
Yeah. And I left that courthouse with such a skip in my step. It was just incredible. When I was writing my book, I had told the story so many times. I felt a real connection to her. And I tracked her down as she was still at the Mercer County Courthouse. And I left a message for her if she ever were to get it to call me. And I received this phone call one day and she says, "I hear you're looking for me." And it was like a shot of joy. I said, "Miss Davis, do you remember me?" And she said, "Do I remember you?" She said, "Oh my goodness." She said, "You're one of the kindest people I've ever met." And she said, "When we had to close for COVID, we were told to take home everything that was important to us. And your note has been hanging on my office wall. And I took it home with me. And now it hangs on the wall with pictures of my grandchildren."
Doesn't get any better than that.
That's true. We just can't underestimate the power of a few kind words. All of us just want to know that we're seen and that we matter. And that is, to me, that's the beauty of this practice.
And then there's this story about the latte.
Yes, a chai latte, my favorite tea. And that was a very similar type of story. A new coffee shop had opened up in town. And I love chai latte, but I'm very particular. I don't want it to be spicy, just sweet. And so I went into the store. There was a line in front of me, and I was happy about that because I wanted to make sure this coffee shop doesn't go out of business because it's within walking distance of my house. And when it's my turn, I look at the blackboard menu behind me, and it doesn't say chai latte. And I looked at the barista. Maybe I had a desperation look in my face, but I said, "Do you have chai latte?" And she looked at me very kind of straight faced, not emotional. She paused and she said, "I'm going to make you the best chai latte you've ever had." And it just took me by surprise. So I said the first thing that came to my mind. And I said, "Well, that's a ballsy statement. Game on." And we just started bantering as she made this chai latte. And then when she finished, she put it on the counter and she pushed it towards me. And she said, "Okay, go ahead, try it." And I took a sip, and absolutely, bar none to this day, best chai latte I've ever had. And so I said, "What is your name?" And she said, "Cynthia." And I said, "Thank you so much. I will be back often." And I left, and I was walking home with my steaming cup of deliciousness. And I thought, I'm definitely going to write to Cynthia and tell her how much I enjoyed that exchange. And so I wrote her, and the next day I went back to the store to hand deliver it, and she wasn't working. So I left it with the manager and said, please make sure she gets this. And I wasn't able to go back for 2 weeks. And I walk in the store, and she's helping another gentleman, and her back is to me. And she says, over her shoulder, without looking at who's there, she said, what can I get you? And I said, well, the best chai latte ever, please. And with that, she turns around and her eyes fill with tears. The poor guy, she stops making his coffee. She comes around the counter and she gives me another one of those amazing hugs and says, surprisingly, the same words as Miss Davis. You made not only my day, my week, my month, my year.
Huh.
And she said, I've been doing this for, 30 years also. She was probably in her 60s. And she said, no one has ever written me a letter of appreciation before. And it's on my dresser, and I've read it every day before I come into work.
Wow.
I did have one other beautiful exchange, and that was somebody who I wrote to, who I know as a nice acquaintance. We're not, intimate friends, but I wrote to her, and I never heard back from her, which is just fine. That's not at all what I was expecting. And probably 2 or 3 months after I'd written the letter, I bumped into her at a party, and she came up to me and she said, I want you to know that your letter overwhelmed me. And since the day that I opened it up, I have been carrying it in my wallet with me. And I was just absolutely blown away that what I thought was just a quick note to tell her how much I admire her work and appreciate her friendship, that it validated her so much that she now was carrying it in her wallet.
Those are stories that give real meaning to human interaction. You know what I mean? People want to be seen. They want to be known as somebody who has related to another person in a very real way, and your letters confirm that for them. So how would you describe to someone the effect of being surrounded by gratitude and joy? What effect does it have on you? What did you find is the answer?
Well, I found that almost all of my relationships improved, and that's because I think this practice allowed me to slow down, and it allowed me to see people in a way that maybe I was just sort of rushing through my day before. And there were so many missed opportunities for connection. And, particularly when I was on this year-long journey, I would linger. And I love the word linger. I'd stay a little longer in a meeting or in conversation with somebody. I'd ask another question or two that maybe I wouldn't have taken the time to ask before. And I would learn more about the person I was speaking to. Or I'd ask questions, I'd listen, and I'd follow up. And I think, we are happiest when we are in relationship with one another. I don't believe that we're meant to live in isolation. That's why one of the reasons COVID was so hard. But when we feel like we have a community, and that can be 1 or 2 people, or it can be, a lot, 100 people, and we feel seen and heard, I think we can collaborate so much better. I think productivity goes up. And so this is a practice that's beautiful in the workplace, as well as in your personal life.
You also wrote a letter to yourself, which is an interesting phenomenon. What was that difficult to write?
Much harder to write to myself than to write to other people.
Because
Absolutely.
you know yourself pretty well.
Yeah. I think it's easier. Well, actually, I give workshops around this, and I have an exercise that I ask people, and that is to write down 3 ways that you were kind to yourself this week and 3 ways that you were unkind to yourself. And it's just an awareness exercise to see which was easier for you to write. And unfortunately, most people find it easier to write ways that they were unkind to themselves. And I think so in writing a letter to yourself, it's to have to come up with the list of what I appreciate about myself. It was a more thoughtful, that letter took me longer to write. But I think that it's a very, very powerful exercise because if when we start to appreciate ourselves and we can treat ourselves with kindness first, it becomes that much easier, I think, to offer kindness to the rest of the world. So
Sure.
it's an exercise I would encourage everybody to do.
And you can almost say one part of you writes a kindness letter to another part of you.
Yes,
And we all have different parts, so.
absolutely. That's a beautiful way to put it.
Now, the last letter you wrote was to your father, and that was what your plan was for the year. Can you tell us about writing that letter?
Sure. So I did have complete clarity from that moment on the airplane that my dad would be my last letter recipient. And that's another powerful exercise that I would encourage all of your listeners to try. Writing to somebody who you love, who has passed away, is it's a beautiful form of connection. So I had always thought that I would read this letter to my dad. I would write it and I would read it to him out loud in the woods behind our house. And we are lucky enough to have some conservation land behind our house, and there's woods and then a lake and then woods. And I was going to sit on a fallen log and read this letter to him. So first I, got a box of Kleenex and a picture of him, and I sat at my kitchen counter and I wrote him a few kind words, 33 years and 9 days after he passed away. And it was a beautiful cold February day. And then I bundled myself up and I went out into the woods. And when I got to the lake, I just felt, for some reason, compelled to stop and read the letter there and not sort of further in the woods where I had imagined it all year. And it was an absolutely still day. It was a beautiful blue sky, and there was not a breath of air. It looked like I had sort of stepped into a painting. It was that still. And so I looked around to make sure nobody was coming as I was about to read a letter out loud. And, I didn't want someone to see the crazy lady reading to nobody. And so nobody was coming. And I then took a few minutes and I read my letter out loud to Dad. And the very, very instant that I said my last words, this enormous swirling wind came out of nowhere. And I call it a swirling wind because I felt it wrap around and around me. And it was so strong that I had to take a step back to catch my balance. The wind was blowing my hair in my face. I had to hold on to the letter so it didn't blow away. And then it stopped. And it went back to absolute stillness. And it was, to me, there is no way that anybody could ever tell me that was not a big bear hug from my dad.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was a precious moment that I hold close to my heart.
Those are phenomena that occur too infrequently in people's lives, partly because they don't open themselves up to them. And you opened yourself up, and there it was.
I love that. I love that, Senator. I think I had so many beautiful comments from letter recipients, and what I heard far more times than I wish I had was some form of, no one has ever done this for me before, or no one has ever said this before to me. But we all have something that we can appreciate about us. And, why not share it? Why not help somebody feel good about themselves?
And in the process, feel good about yourself.
Exactly. I will say that I like who I am much more when I am actively doing this practice. And honestly, it can be on the back of a receipt, on a napkin, on monogram stationery, on company letterhead. When you put your words down in writing, I feel like that your gratitude for that person is sort of sealed within the paper. And to know that your recipient is going to hold the same piece of paper that you held, really, to me, it just sort of solidifies the feeling.
Well, you've given us all a lot. You've given us a wonderful idea of how to practice gratitude and kindness. And all I want to say is that I appreciate you, and I know our listeners do too.
Well, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that you and your team found me and that you've given me an opportunity to spend time with you, another Princetonian who I admire.
Tracey, thank you so much. I've been speaking with Tracey Gates. Her book's called The Power of a Few Kind Words. Create a more meaningful life, one letter at a time. And you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to challenge our listeners to write those letters of appreciation and tell us about it. Write the letter and tell us how you feel and what you get back from those letters. I love hearing from you. Write me on Facebook. Our page is American Voices with Senator Bill Bradley. We're also now on Instagram. You can write me there too. Thank you for listening to American Voices here on my YouTube channel. For more interviews celebrating the goodness and creativity of the American people, click the subscribe button below.